Arrogant classmates invites the class loser after 7 years to mock him, unaware he is now worth $300 million. The invitation arrived on Italian leather stationery to his penthouse overlooking Central Park. The same kids who'd shoved him into lockers now wanted him at their reunion, completely unaware that the class loser they planned to humiliate could buy their entire hometown. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. The morning sun cast golden rays across the infinity pool of the $47 million Beverly Hills mansion, where 30-year-old Daniel Chen stood in his home gym, sweat dripping from his lean frame as he finished his daily workout. The same discipline that had built his tech empire now sculpted his body, a far cry from the skinny, awkward teenager he'd once been. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the sprawling city below, a reminder of how far he'd climbed from those dark high school hallways in Phoenix, Arizona. His phone buzzed against the marble countertop. The notification made his blood run cold. Westfield High School Class of 2017 to 7-year reunion invitation. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he opened the message. The same familiar names populated the planning committee: Trevor Martinez, Madison Walsh, Kyle Thompson. The holy trinity of his teenage torment. His jaw clenched as memories flooded back, the countless times they'd cornered him in the Phoenix heat after school, the humiliation during prom when Madison had pretended to ask him as a cruel joke, the way Trevor had once stuffed him into a locker so hard he'd missed his AP physics exam. But what stung most was the tone of the invitation. Sickeningly sweet, dripping with fake enthusiasm. "We can't wait to see what everyone's been up to. Come share your stories, no matter how small." The subtext was clear. They were expecting the same broken, pathetic kid they'd left behind in the Arizona desert 7 years ago. Daniel walked to his wall of awards: Forbes 30 Under 30, Time Magazine's Tech Innovator of the Year, a personal thank you letter from the Governor of California for his charitable contributions. His AI company, Neuralink Solutions, had revolutionized medical technology and made him worth exactly $347 million at last count. Yet none of it filled the hollow ache in his chest when he thought about those Phoenix hallways. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away in Manhattan, Isabella Rodriguez rushed through the gleaming corridors of the Plaza Hotel, her heels clicking against marble floors as she coordinated the final details for a corporate gala. At 29, she'd built her event planning company from nothing, working with New York's elite to create unforgettable experiences. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing all morning: a crisis with the Portland, Oregon Tech Conference, a last-minute venue change for a Seattle wedding, and now this. "Isabella, we have a problem," her assistant Maya called out, struggling to keep pace. "The Phoenix reunion client wants to upgrade everything. They're talking about renting out the entire Scottsdale resort, flying people in private jets. Someone's bankrolling this thing big time." Isabella paused, her dark eyes scanning the contract. Westfield High School, Class of 2017. The budget had mysteriously tripled overnight, with specific instructions to make it spectacular. Money is no object. Something felt off about the whole arrangement. In her experience, high school reunions were potluck affairs in gymnasium, not champagne soirees at five-star resorts. "Who's paying for this?" she asked, but the answer came back as a generic LLC. Anonymous funding for what was clearly going to be the most expensive high school reunion in Arizona history. She thought about declining. Her company handled Fortune 500 events, not high school nostalgia trips. But something about the mystery intrigued her. Plus, the commission would fund her dream of opening a second office in Los Angeles. "Book the Scottsdale resort," she decided. And Maya. I'm handling this one personally. Something tells me this reunion is going to be anything but ordinary. Back in Beverly Hills, Daniel stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. The awkward teenager was gone, replaced by a man who commanded boardrooms and had dinner with senators. His black hair was perfectly styled, his skin clear, his body fit. He'd had his teeth fixed, hired the best stylists, learned to carry himself with confidence. But inside, he still felt like that 17-year-old kid eating lunch alone in the Phoenix cafeteria, watching Trevor and his crew from across the room, wondering why he was never good enough. He opened his laptop and began typing. "Thank you for the invitation. I'll be there." His finger hovered over the send button. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to let sleeping dogs lie. He had everything now: success, money, respect from world leaders and tech titans. Why did the approval of people he'd left behind in Arizona still matter? But deep down he knew why. Those scars had never healed. Every business victory, every magazine cover, every billion-dollar deal had been an unconscious attempt to prove to Trevor Martinez that he was worth something. That the kid they'd terrorized in the Desert Ridge neighborhood of Phoenix had become someone who mattered. He hit send. What do you think drives successful people to still seek approval from their past? Share your thoughts below. Sometimes our greatest victories are hollow until we face our deepest wounds. The response came within hours, and Daniel's stomach dropped as he read it. The tone was everything he'd feared: condescending, dripping with fake concern. "Danny, OMG, so excited you're coming. Can't wait to see what you've been up to. Don't worry if you can't afford the resort. We've got scholarship spots available. Just like old times, right? Zoxo Madison." Daniel's hands clenched into fists. Scholarship spots. They still saw him as the charity case, the kid whose single mother worked double shifts at the Phoenix diner just to keep the lights on. They had no idea that he could buy the entire Scottsdale resort without blinking, that his yearly charitable donations exceeded their lifetime earnings. For the first time in years, Daniel Chen smiled a smile that didn't reach his eyes. They wanted a reunion? They were about to get one they'd never forget. The desert sunset painted the Scottsdale resort in shades of amber and crimson as Daniel's black Bugatti Chiron pulled up to the valet stand. He'd flown his private jet from Los Angeles that morning, but had driven the final stretch through the Arizona desert. He needed time to think, to prepare for what was about to unfold. The valet's eyes widened as Daniel stepped out, his Tom Ford suit perfectly tailored, a Patek Philippe watch catching the dying light. "Welcome to Scottsdale Resort, sir." "Checking in." "Just visiting," Daniel replied, his voice steady despite the hurricane in his chest. The resort was transformed beyond recognition. What should have been a modest reunion had become a spectacle worthy of a Hollywood premiere. Ice sculptures dotted the entrance, champagne fountains sparkled under string lights, and a red carpet led toward the main ballroom. Someone had spared no expense, and Daniel had a sinking suspicion he knew who. Isabella stood near the entrance, clipboard in hand, directing her team with the precision of a conductor. Her black cocktail dress was elegant but professional, her dark hair pulled back to reveal diamond earrings that caught the resort's ambient lighting. She was beautiful in an effortless way that made Daniel's breath catch, the kind of natural grace he'd never encountered in the corporate boardrooms of Manhattan or the tech conferences of Silicon Valley. "Excuse me," she called out as he approached, not recognizing him as anything other than another early guest. "The reunion doesn't officially start for another hour. You're welcome to wait in the bar area." Their eyes met for the first time, and Daniel felt something shift inside him, a warmth he hadn't experienced since, well, maybe never. Isabella's expression was kind but distracted, her mind clearly on 1,000 logistics details. "I'm exactly where I need to be," Daniel said softly. Before Isabella could respond, a voice cut through the desert evening like a rusty blade. "Well, well, well. Look what the cat dragged in." Trevor Martinez emerged from the resort's shadows, his expensive suit unable to hide the softness that 7 years of comfortable living had added to his frame. His smile was the same predatory grin that had haunted Daniel's nightmares, but now it looked different. Smaller somehow, less intimidating on a man approaching 30 than it had on a teenage bully. Behind Trevor came the others. Madison Walsh, her blonde hair perfectly styled but her eyes already calculating how to extract maximum humiliation from this moment, and Kyle Thompson, whose Letterman jacket had been replaced by a polo shirt that stretched tight across his beer gut. "Danny Chen," Madison purred, her voice honey-sweet with underlying venom. "I honestly didn't think you'd show. How brave of you." Daniel felt the familiar churning in his stomach, the same helpless rage that had consumed him in those Phoenix high school hallways. But something was different now. Isabella was watching the interaction with growing concern, her instincts as an event planner picking up on the underlying tension. "Friends of yours?" she asked Daniel, stepping slightly closer to him in a gesture that felt protective. "Old classmates," Daniel replied, his voice carefully neutral. Trevor laughed, the sound harsh against the desert evening. "Oh, we go way back. Danny here was special. Had his own unique place in our high school ecosystem, didn't you, Danny?" The words hit exactly as intended. Daniel's jaw tightened, and for a moment he was 17 again. Small, powerless, watching these same people decide his social worth with casual cruelty. "I remember you being different," Madison added, her eyes scanning Daniel's obviously expensive clothes with confusion. "Though I have to say, you clean up better than expected. Did someone loan you that suit for tonight?" Isabella's eyebrows shot up. There was something deeply wrong with this conversation, something that made her event planner instincts scream danger. In her years of high-end events, she'd learned to read people, to spot the power dynamics that could make or break a gathering. And everything about this interaction felt poisonous. "Actually," Isabella interjected, her voice crisp with professional authority, "I believe we should get the evening started. The catering staff is ready too." "Oh, don't worry about Danny," Kyle interrupted, his grin matching Trevor's. "He's used to waiting. Always was patient, weren't you, buddy? Remember how you'd wait outside the cafeteria until we were done eating? So considerate." The memory hit Daniel like a physical blow. They'd made him wait to enter the cafeteria until after they'd finished. Claiming his presence ruined their appetite. The humiliation of standing in those Phoenix hallways, stomach growling, watching other students eat while he waited for permission to exist in the same space. But this time something was different. Isabella was watching him with growing understanding, her expression shifting from confusion to concern to something that looked like protective anger. "I think," she said, her voice dropping to a tone that made seasoned Manhattan executives tremble, "there's been a misunderstanding about tonight." Trevor's laugh grew louder. "Oh, there's no misunderstanding. We invited Danny here because we wanted to see how he was doing. Show him what success looks like." He gestured to his watch, his car keys visible in his other hand. "Some of us have done pretty well for ourselves since high school." "Real estate," Madison added smugly. "Trevor practically owns half of Phoenix now. Kyle's got his construction company. And I married into the Waldorf family. You know, the Hotel Waldorfs." She held up her hand, showing off a diamond ring that was impressive but not extraordinary. We've all made something of ourselves. Daniel felt the familiar burning in his throat, the same suffocating sensation he'd experienced every day in those Arizona high school hallways. They were doing it again, defining his worth, deciding his place in their hierarchy, assuming he was still the same broken kid they'd tormented. Isabella stepped forward, and Daniel noticed her hands were shaking slightly with what looked like controlled fury. "I'm sorry, but I need to clarify something. This reunion was paid for by someone who believes in giving back," Trevor interrupted smoothly. "Anonymous donor. Probably felt sorry for our class, and wanted to make sure everyone could afford to come. Even Danny." The condescension in his voice was suffocating. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, and suddenly he was back in the Phoenix heat, pressed against lockers that smelled like industrial cleaner and teenage desperation, while these same voices explained why he didn't belong. When he opened his eyes, Isabella was staring at him with an expression he'd never seen before. Not pity, not sympathy, but recognition. As if she saw exactly what was happening and found it unforgivable. "You know what?" Daniel said quietly, his voice barely audible above the desert wind. "You're right." Trevor's grin widened. "See, Danny always was realistic about his place in. You're right that some things never change." Daniel's voice grew stronger, clearer. "7 years ago you decided what I was worth. Tonight you're doing the same thing." He looked directly at Madison, then Kyle, then finally Trevor. "The only difference is that now I get to decide what you're worth." Isabella's breath caught. There was something in Daniel's voice now, a quiet authority that made the desert air seem to vibrate with electricity. "And the anonymous donor?" Daniel continued, reaching into his jacket pocket. "That wasn't some random philanthropist." He pulled out his phone, showed them a screenshot of the payment confirmation. "That was me." The silence that followed was so complete that the only sound was the distant splash of the resort's fountains and the whisper of wind through palm trees. Trevor's face went pale. That's not possible. The budget for this was $300,000, Daniel said calmly, plus another 100 for the private jet rentals, 50 for the champagne, 25 for the ice sculptures. His smile was gentle, but his eyes were steel. "I wanted to make sure everyone could afford to come. Even you." Madison's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Kyle took a stumbling step backward. Isabella stared at Daniel with growing amazement, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place in her mind. "You see," Daniel continued, his voice carrying across the desert evening with devastating quiet, "I did make something of myself. I built a company that revolutionized medical AI. I employ about 4,000 people across offices in San Francisco, Seattle, Austin, and Boston. Forbes valued my company at just over $2 billion last quarter." Trevor's expensive watch suddenly looked very cheap. "But the most important thing I learned," Daniel said, turning to look at Isabella, "is that success isn't about proving anything to people who never mattered." His eyes met hers, and something electric passed between them. "It's about finding people who matter to you." What do you think happens when the people who defined your worth discover they were wrong about everything? Sometimes the greatest revenge is simply becoming who you were always meant to be. The desert wind picked up, stirring the palm trees and carrying with it the promise that this night was about to change everything. For Daniel, for Isabella, and for 3 bullies who had just discovered that the boy they'd broken had become a man they couldn't touch. Daniel retreated to his presidential suite on the top floor of the Scottsdale resort, his hands still shaking from the confrontation downstairs. The $15,000 per night penthouse overlooked the entire Salt River Valley, but the breathtaking view of Phoenix's sprawling desert landscape did nothing to calm the storm raging inside him. He loosened his Hermes tie and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, pressing his palms against the cool glass. 7 years of therapy, 7 years of building walls around his heart, and it had all crumbled in 30 seconds. The moment Trevor's face had shifted from smug superiority to stunned recognition, Daniel had felt that familiar rush, not of triumph, but of that same desperate need for acceptance that had haunted him through every lonely night in high school. This isn't who I am anymore, he told himself, but his reflection in the window looked like a stranger. The confident billionaire was gone, replaced by that 17-year-old boy who'd cried himself to sleep in his mother's tiny apartment in Phoenix's Maryvale neighborhood. His phone buzzed with notifications. Text messages from former classmates who'd suddenly remembered his existence, LinkedIn requests from people who'd never spoken to him, emails from local Phoenix news stations wanting interviews. Word was spreading through social media like wildfire. Danny Chen is worth $300 million. The same kids who'd made his life hell were now desperate to bask in his reflected glory. Daniel deleted every message without reading them. He'd gotten what he came for. Their shock, their desperate scrambling for his attention, their sudden realization that they'd bet on the wrong horse. So why did he feel emptier than ever? A knock at the door interrupted his spiral. He considered ignoring it, but the gentle persistence suggested it wasn't going away. Mr. Chen. Isabella's voice carried through the heavy mahogany door. I wanted to check on you. You seemed upset. Daniel almost laughed at the understatement. Upset didn't begin to cover the emotional earthquake that had just leveled him. He opened the door to find Isabella standing there with a bottle of top-shelf tequila and 2 glasses. Not the cheap stuff they were serving downstairs, but Clase Azul Ultra, worth more than most people's monthly salary. I raided the resort's private collection, she said with a slight smile. Figured you might need something stronger than champagne. I don't drink, Daniel said automatically, then caught himself. That was another lie, another carefully constructed piece of his public persona. The truth was, he didn't trust himself to drink. Too much like his father, who disappeared into a bottle when the pressure got too much. But something about Isabella's honest brown eyes made him step aside and let her in. Isabella moved through the opulent suite with professional ease, but Daniel caught her subtle reaction to the luxury. The way her fingers traced the Italian marble countertop, how her eyes lingered on the original Picasso hanging casually on the wall. She wasn't impressed by wealth for its own sake, but she appreciated craftsmanship and beauty. You don't have to pretend this is normal, Daniel said, settling into one of the leather chairs that cost more than most cars. The money, I mean. It's okay to be impressed. Isabella poured 2 glasses of the golden tequila, the liquid catching the desert sunset streaming through the windows. I've planned events for tech billionaires, oil executives, and old Hollywood money. I've seen wealth. She handed him a glass, their fingers brushing briefly. But I've never seen someone look so miserable after getting exactly what they wanted. The observation hit harder than Trevor's fists ever had. Daniel stared into the amber liquid, seeing his distorted reflection on its surface. You think that's what I wanted? To humiliate them. Didn't you? Isabella's voice was gentle but direct. You could have ignored the invitation. Could have sent a polite decline. Instead, you showed up in a car worth more than their houses, dressed like you stepped off the cover of Forbes, ready to watch them squirm. Daniel wanted to deny it, to claim some higher motivation, but the words died in his throat. She was right. He'd orchestrated the entire evening like a business presentation. calculated for maximum impact. Every detail had been chosen to demonstrate his superiority. The Bugatti, the designer suit, the casual mention of his net worth. "They destroyed me," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every day for 4 years, they made sure I knew I was worthless. Do you know what it's like to be 17 years old and have your entire peer group treat you like you're invisible? To have the girl you've had a crush on since freshman year ask you to prom as a joke, then laugh when you actually believe her?" Isabella's expression softened, but she didn't offer empty platitudes or try to diminish his pain. She simply listened, her presence an anchor in the storm of his emotions. "Madison Walsh," he continued, the name tasting bitter on his tongue. "She was everything I thought I wanted. Beautiful, popular, confident. I spent 2 years building up the courage to talk to her, and when she finally noticed me..." He laughed bitterly. "Trevor bet her $50 she wouldn't be able to get me to show up to prom. She collected her money while I stood there in my rental tux, holding a corsage I'd saved 3 weeks of lunch money to buy." The memory was as sharp as ever, carefully preserved in all its humiliating detail. The way the entire gymnasium had erupted in laughter when Madison had revealed the prank. The way Trevor had slapped him on the back with mock sympathy, telling him he'd learned a valuable lesson about staying in his lane. "So yes," Daniel said, meeting Isabella's eyes for the first time. "I wanted them to know what they'd lost. I wanted them to realize that the kid they'd written off had become everything they'd never be." Isabella took a slow sip of her tequila, considering his words. "And how does it feel, now that they know?" Daniel expected to feel vindicated, triumphant, finally free from the ghosts that had haunted him since leaving Arizona. Instead, he felt hollow, like a victory that had cost him something essential. "Empty," he admitted. "Like I've wasted 7 years of my life trying to impress people whose opinions shouldn't matter." "But they do matter," Isabella said quietly. "That's the problem, isn't it? You built an empire, changed the world with your technology, helped millions of people with your medical AI systems. But none of it felt real until Trevor Martinez acknowledged it." Her words cut through his defenses like a scalpel, exposing the truth he'd been avoiding. Every business decision, every late night in the lab, every sacrifice had been motivated not by passion or purpose, but by a desperate need to prove his worth to people who'd already moved on with their lives. "I should go," Isabella said, standing and smoothing her dress. "Your classmates are asking where you went. They're planning some kind of speech, wanting to honor your incredible success story." Her voice carried a note of distaste. "Apparently, you're exactly the kind of inspiration they want to associate themselves with now." Daniel's stomach turned. Of course they were. Now that he was worth something, they'd want to rewrite history, pretend they'd always believed in him, maybe even take credit for motivating his success through their tough love. "Will you tell them I'm not feeling well?" he asked. "I think I'd like to be alone." Isabella paused at the door, her hand on the handle. "You know, I've planned a lot of events where people came to show off, to prove something to someone from their past. The ones who actually found what they were looking for? They weren't the ones trying to impress anyone. They were the ones who'd learned to impress themselves." She left him alone with the tequila and the desert sunset, but her words lingered long after the door closed. Daniel walked back to the window, watching the lights of Phoenix flicker to life in the gathering darkness. Somewhere out there was his mother's old apartment in Maryvale, the tiny space where she'd raised him on diner wages and unconditional love. She'd been so proud when he'd gotten his first job at Microsoft, so excited when he'd started his own company. She'd cried when Forbes had featured him on their cover, not because of the money or the prestige, but because her son was happy, was making a difference in the world. When was the last time he'd felt that kind of pure joy? When did success become about proving others wrong instead of proving himself right? Daniel pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found his mother's number. She'd moved to a beautiful house in Sedona that he'd bought for her. Close enough to visit, far enough from the memories that haunted Phoenix. He started to dial, then stopped. What would he tell her? That he'd flown across the country to show off to his high school bullies? That he'd let 7 years of accomplishments be reduced to a weapon against people who probably rarely thought about him at all? Instead, he walked to his laptop and opened the file containing his speech for tomorrow's medical technology conference in San Francisco. Real work, real purpose, the kind that actually mattered. But even as he tried to focus on the words, his mind kept drifting back to Isabella's observation. The ones who actually found what they were looking for weren't trying to impress anyone but themselves. The question that haunted him as night fell over the Arizona desert was simple but devastating. In his relentless pursuit of external validation, when had he stopped trying to impress the only person whose opinion truly mattered, himself? Outside his window, Phoenix sparkled like a constellation fallen to earth, beautiful and distant and full of stories he was finally ready to leave behind. But first, he had to figure out how to write a new one. The emergency meeting room at the Scottsdale Resort felt suffocatingly small despite its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Sonoran Desert. Daniel sat across from Isabella at the polished conference table, both of them still processing the events of the evening. The resort's general manager had insisted they handle the situation privately. 23 people hospitalized, potential lawsuits, and a media circus brewing outside. Mr. Chen, the manager wrung his hands nervously. We need to coordinate our response carefully. The Phoenix NBC affiliate is already setting up cameras in the parking lot. Isabella watched Daniel's jaw tighten. Even in a crisis, he commanded the room with quiet authority. His earlier vulnerability had been replaced by the steel she'd glimpsed when he'd effortlessly handled Trevor's attack. She found herself studying the sharp line of his profile, the way his fingers drummed thoughtfully against the mahogany table. What exactly are you proposing? Daniel's voice was measured, controlled. A joint statement. Ms. Rodriguez as the event coordinator, you as... Well, we'll figure out how to position your role. The important thing is presenting a unified front. Isabella felt a flutter of panic. Her entire career could crumble if this went badly. I need to contact my insurance company, my legal team in New York. No. Daniel's interruption was gentle but firm. Let me handle this. She bristled. With all due respect, this is my company's reputation on the line. I can't just... Isabella. The way he said her name made her breath catch. Trust me. Please. The general manager's phone buzzed. The health department is here. They're requiring both of you to remain available for questioning. Could be hours. As the door closed behind him, silence stretched between them. Isabella found herself alone with the most enigmatic man she'd ever met, a man who'd just saved dozens of people while his former classmates lay unconscious from what appeared to be mass food poisoning. This is insane, she muttered, pacing to the window. The desert stretched endlessly toward the mountains, painted orange by the setting sun. 7 years I've been building my company. One night and it could all be gone. It won't be. She turned to find Daniel watching her intently. How can you be so calm? Those people, Trevor, Madison, they were trying to destroy you tonight. And now they're all in Phoenix General Hospital, and we're the ones left to clean up the mess. Daniel stood, moving to join her at the window. This close, she could smell his subtle cologne, see the faint scar along his jawline she hadn't noticed before. "Can I tell you something? About that night senior year." Isabella nodded, not trusting her voice. "Prom night. Madison asked me to meet her at the Desert Ridge Mall before the dance. Said she wanted to apologize for how she'd treated me." His voice grew distant. "I was so desperate to believe someone finally saw me as worth something that I bought a tuxedo with money I'd saved for my job at Radio Shack. Spent 2 hours getting ready." He paused, his reflection ghost-like in the window. "She never showed. Instead, I got a video message of her and Trevor laughing about Danny the charity case, thinking he had a chance. They'd planned the whole thing." Isabella's chest tightened. "Daniel." "I spent prom night sitting in my car in that mall parking lot, wondering what was wrong with me. Why wasn't I worth basic human kindness?" He turned to face her, and she saw something raw and unguarded in his eyes. "Tonight wasn't about revenge, Isabella. Tonight was about finally proving to myself that I matter." The confession hung between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross. Isabella felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition of pain she understood all too well. "I was the scholarship kid too," she said quietly. "Different coast, same story. My parents cleaned offices in Manhattan so I could go to private school on the Upper East Side. Do you know what it's like to pretend you belong somewhere when everyone can smell the desperation on you?" Daniel's expression softened. "Is that why you became an event planner? Creating perfect moments for other people?" The question hit too close to home. Maybe. Or maybe I just wanted to prove I could orchestrate the kind of life I was never invited to live. A knock interrupted them. The general manager peered in apologetically. "I'm sorry, but there's been a development. The Phoenix Police Department wants to interview you both separately. Something about the catering company's background check." Isabella's stomach dropped. "What kind of background check?" "Apparently, they're not who they claim to be. The real Sonora Gourmet Catering has been out of business for 6 months." Daniel and Isabella exchanged glances. Someone had orchestrated this entire evening. But who? And why? "We're going to need lawyers," Isabella said, her event planner instincts kicking in. "Good ones. This is about to become a criminal investigation." "Already handled," Daniel said quietly. He pulled out his phone, scrolling to a contact. "David. It's Daniel Chen. I need the best criminal defense team in Phoenix at the Scottsdale Resort within the hour. No, it's not for me. It's for someone I—" He glanced at Isabella. Someone important. As he spoke, Isabella found herself really looking at him for the first time. Not the billionaire tech mogul or the wounded teenager, but the man underneath. The way he'd instinctively protected her interests, handled the crisis with grace, opened up about his deepest hurt. When he hung up, she asked, "Why are you helping me? You don't even know me." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "Because 7 years ago, I would have given anything for someone to believe I was worth helping. And tonight, when everyone else saw me as either a target or a meal ticket, you saw me as just Daniel." The weight of his words settled between them. Outside, camera crews were setting up for the late-night news broadcasts. Inside, they were trapped together until the authorities cleared them. Two people who'd spent their lives building walls, suddenly finding themselves on the same side of an impossible situation. Isabella's phone buzzed with a text from her assistant in New York. "CNN is calling. What do I tell them?" "This is going to be everywhere by morning," she said, showing Daniel the message. Phoenix tech billionaire, mysterious food poisoning. High school reunion gone wrong. The tabloids are going to have a field day. Are you afraid? He asked. Isabella considered the question. 24 hours ago, her biggest worry had been whether the champagne would be the right temperature. Now she was potentially facing criminal charges, media scrutiny, and professional ruin alongside a man who'd already turned her understanding of success and worth completely upside down. Terrified, she admitted. But also, I don't know. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Daniel's smile was different this time. Not the polished CEO grin or the bitter twist of revenge, but something real and warm and entirely his own. Even trapped in a conference room in Scottsdale while your career potentially crumbles around you? Especially then. The words surprised her with their honesty. Maybe that's what it takes sometimes. Everything falls apart before you can build something real. The door opened again, and 2 Phoenix police detectives entered, followed by a team of lawyers Daniel had somehow materialized. As they prepared to face whatever came next, Isabella realized that somewhere between the champagne toast and this surreal evening, everything had changed. She wasn't just the event planner anymore, and he wasn't just the mysterious benefactor. They were 2 people who'd found each other in the ruins of a perfectly orchestrated disaster, and for the first time in either of their lives, they weren't facing the storm alone. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain as Daniel and Isabella stepped onto the secluded balcony overlooking Camelback Mountain. The reunion's chaos felt a world away, the clinking of champagne glasses, Trevor's desperate attempts to save face, Madison's humiliated tears. Out here, under Arizona's star-painted sky, it was just the 2 of them. Isabella's hands still trembled slightly from the confrontation inside. She'd watched Daniel transform from the quiet, mysterious billionaire into someone fierce and protective when Trevor had cornered her near the Phoenix City skyline backdrop, his alcohol-soaked breath hot against her face as he grabbed her arm. I need to know, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the desert breeze. What they did to you. What really happened in those hallways. Daniel's jaw tightened. For 7 years, he'd buried those memories beneath layers of success. Buried them so deep that sometimes he could pretend they'd happened to someone else. But something about Isabella's gentle presence, the way she'd stepped between him and Trevor without hesitation, made the walls he'd built start to crumble. You don't want to hear this, he said, gripping the stone railing until his knuckles went white. Yes, I do. She moved closer, her hand finding his. Daniel, I've spent all night watching you carry this weight. Whatever happened, it's eating you alive. He closed his eyes, and suddenly he was 17 again, standing in the parking lot of Desert Ridge High School in Phoenix, holding the acceptance letter to MIT that should have been the happiest moment of his life. It was April 15, 2017, he began, his voice hollow. 3 weeks before graduation. I'd just gotten my full scholarship to MIT. Full ride, everything paid for. I was so excited God, I was so stupid. I thought finally, maybe finally, I'd proven I was worth something. Isabella waited, sensing the dam was about to break. I ran to find my mom first. She was working the lunch shift at Denny's on Camelback Road, barely making rent on our studio apartment near Sky Harbor Airport. When I showed her the letter, she cried. Actually cried tears of joy in front of all those customers. She said. His voice cracked. She said I was going to be the first person in our family to go to college. That all her sacrifices meant something. The desert stars seemed to blur as Daniel's eyes filled with tears he'd refused to shed for 7 years. I was walking back to school, practically floating. The letter was in my back pocket, and I kept touching it, making sure it was real. That's when I saw Trevor's BMW pulled up near the football field. Him, Madison, Kyle, and 3 other guys from the team. Isabella's grip on his hand tightened. They saw me coming and started laughing. Trevor yelled, "Hey, Charity Case. Heard you got some fancy rejection letter today." I should have kept walking. I should have just ignored them like always. But I was so happy, so proud. I actually thought maybe this would change things. Maybe if they knew I was going to MIT, they'd finally see me as more than just their punching bag. Daniel's breathing became shallow, the memory pulling him back into that teenager's desperate need for acceptance. So I told them. I actually pulled out the letter and showed them. I said, "It's not a rejection letter. I got into MIT. Full scholarship." And for a second, just 1 second, I thought I saw something like respect in Trevor's eyes. What happened next? Isabella asked, though her heart was already breaking for the answer. Trevor grabbed the letter. I started reading it out loud in this mocking voice, making fun of my mom's name, our address in the cheapest part of Phoenix. Then he said. Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper. He said, "Boys, looks like the Charity Case thinks he's smart enough for MIT. What do you think we should do with this fantasy letter?" Isabella felt sick. They held me down while Trevor tore it into pieces. Small pieces like confetti. Then they threw them in the air and watched them scatter across the desert wind. Madison was filming the whole thing on her phone, laughing. She posted it to Instagram with the caption, "When delusion meets reality. #CharityCaseReality, #PhoenixLoser." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of cruelty that still echoed 7 years later. "But that wasn't the worst part," Daniel continued, his voice barely audible. "The worst part was that I believed them. For just a moment, watching those pieces blow away across the Sonoran Desert, I wondered if they were right. If I was just deluding myself into thinking I could be something more than what they'd always told me I was." Isabella turned to face him fully, her eyes blazing with anger. "Please tell me you had another copy." I did. But the damage was done. Every day after that, until graduation, they'd whisper MIT behind me in the halls and laugh. During the graduation ceremony at AK Chin Pavilion, when they announced I was going to MIT, Trevor started a slow clap that turned into this sarcastic applause. Even my moment of triumph felt poisoned. He pulled his phone from his pocket and showed her a screenshot he'd kept all these years. Madison's Instagram post. The video showed Daniel's devastation as clear as day. A 17-year-old boy watching his dreams literally blow away in the desert wind while his classmates laughed. I never forgot how it felt to be that powerless. Every company I built, every deal I closed, every million I earned, it was all to prove that moment wrong. To prove I was worth something. Isabella's eyes filled with tears. "Daniel, you were always worth something. Their cruelty never defined your value." "The real tragedy," Daniel said, staring out at the Phoenix skyline twinkling in the distance, "is that I let it. For 7 years, I let those 30 seconds in a parking lot drive every decision I made. I became successful, yes, but I also became empty. I never let anyone close because I was terrified they'd see what Trevor saw, that underneath all the success, I was still just that pathetic kid eating lunch alone." Isabella stepped closer, her hand reaching up to touch his cheek. "I don't see that kid, Daniel. I see a man who built an empire from nothing, who treats waitstaff with kindness, who donated anonymously to kids who couldn't afford college because he remembered what it felt like to struggle. I see someone who's been carrying wounds that were never his to carry. Daniel leaned into her touch, feeling something shift in his chest. For the first time since that day in the parking lot, he felt truly seen, not for his net worth or his achievements, but for the broken places he'd spent 7 years trying to hide. They tried to destroy your dreams that day, Isabella whispered. But look at you now. You didn't just survive, you soared. And the most beautiful part? Despite everything they did, you still have the biggest heart in that room. Daniel pulled her closer, the desert wind wrapping around them like a blessing. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out across the Sonoran desert, wild and free and unashamed of its voice. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair, "for seeing me, the real me." "Thank you for trusting me with your story," she replied. "It's beautiful and heartbreaking and heroic all at once. Just like you." As they stood there under Arizona's infinite sky, Daniel felt something he'd never experienced before. The profound peace of being fully known and completely accepted. The boy who'd watched his dreams scatter in the desert wind was finally, truly free. Scottsdale Resort Gardens, Arizona, 11:30 p.m. The reunion crowd had finally thinned, leaving only the desert stars and the soft glow of string lights draped between palm trees. Daniel found himself walking the moonlit paths of the resort gardens with Isabella, both of them having shed their formal facades somewhere between the fountain and the koi pond. The Arizona night air carried the scent of desert blooms and possibility. "You know what the funny thing is?" Daniel said, his voice softer than it had been all evening. They'd been talking for over an hour now, real conversation that flowed like water after years of drought. "I used to dream about this moment. Coming back, showing them all how wrong they were about me. But now that it's happening." "It doesn't feel the way you imagined," Isabella finished, understanding flickering in her dark eyes. She'd kicked off her heels and was walking barefoot on the cool stone path, her silk dress flowing in the gentle breeze. "Exactly." Daniel stopped beside a desert rose bush, its delicate pink flowers glowing silver in the moonlight. "I thought victory would taste different. Sweeter, maybe. Instead, it just feels empty." Isabella studied his profile in the starlight. The strong jaw, the way his shoulders had finally relaxed, the vulnerability he was letting her see. This wasn't the cold tech mogul from the business magazines or the wounded teenager from Trevor's Cruel Stories. This was just Daniel, stripped of armor and pretense. "Can I tell you something?" she asked, settling onto a stone bench beside a trickling water feature. "When I first saw you tonight, I thought you were just another rich guy playing games. I've seen it 1,000 times in Manhattan. Powerful men who use their wealth like a weapon." Daniel joined her on the bench, close enough that she could smell his cologne. Something subtle and expensive that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. "And now I see someone who's been carrying pain for 7 years, trying to heal wounds that money can't touch." Her voice was gentle, free of the professional polish she'd worn earlier. "You know what gave you away?" "What?" "The way you looked at that photo of your mother on your phone. When you were telling me about her working those double shifts in Phoenix, saving every penny for your college fund, your whole face changed. That's not the look of a man who's forgotten where he came from." Daniel was quiet for a moment, his fingers absently tracing patterns on the stone bench. "She died 3 years ago. Cancer. I was able to give her everything in those final months. The best doctors, a beautiful house in Marin County overlooking San Francisco Bay, nurses around the clock. But you know what she asked for." Isabella waited, sensing the weight of whatever was coming. She wanted to go back to that little diner in Phoenix where she used to work, just for one afternoon. Said she wanted to see her old friends, wanted to remember when life was simpler. Daniel's voice cracked slightly. I offered to buy the whole building, renovate it, anything. But she just wanted to sit in booth 7 and order a vanilla milkshake like she used to on her break. Did you take her? Of course. We flew there in my private jet, this massive production with medical equipment and specialists. But when we walked into that diner, she just looked home. For the first time since her diagnosis, she looked peaceful. Isabella felt tears prick her eyes. She sounds like she was an amazing woman. She was. And she would have hated tonight. Me using my success to intimidate people, playing their petty games. He turned to face Isabella fully. What about you? What's your story? And don't give me the corporate bio this time. Isabella laughed, the sound like wind chimes in the desert air. Fair enough. I grew up in East LA, daughter of a mechanic and a seamstress. My parents worked themselves to the bone so I could go to college, get out of the neighborhood. I started my event planning business because I wanted to create beautiful moments for people, to give them the celebrations they deserved. But somewhere along the way it became about money and status instead of joy. I stopped planning quinceañeras for families in my old neighborhood and started throwing parties for hedge fund managers who spend more on champagne than my parents made in a year. Do you miss it? The old work. Every day. Her admission surprised even her with its honesty. There's something pure about planning a little girl's sweet 16, watching her face light up when she sees her dream come true. These Manhattan galas are impressive, but they're not real somehow. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the desert night wrapping around them like a warm blanket. In the distance, they could hear the last stragglers from the reunion calling goodbyes to each other. Car doors slamming, engine starting. Isabella, Daniel said quietly, can I ask you something without you thinking I'm completely insane? She turned to face him, noticing how the moonlight caught the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. Shoot. What if we just left? Right now. Got in my car and drove somewhere, anywhere but here. Vegas, the Grand Canyon, hell, we could be in San Diego by sunrise watching the waves. The suggestion hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they dared cross. Daniel. She started, but he held up a hand. I know how it sounds. We just met, you have a business to run, I have board meetings in Silicon Valley on Monday. But when's the last time you did something completely spontaneous? Something that had nothing to do with profit margins or client expectations. Isabella felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of strings she hadn't realized were so tightly wound. You're talking about running away. I'm talking about running toward something. I've spent 7 years building walls, accumulating wealth, proving points to people who never mattered. Tonight, sitting here with you is the first time I've felt light, like I could breathe again. She was quiet for so long that Daniel began to worry he'd misread everything, that the connection he felt was one-sided fantasy. My parents always told me that real success isn't what you accumulate, it's what you're brave enough to let go of, she finally said. I haven't been brave in a very long time. Daniel reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and took her hand. Her fingers were warm, calloused from years of hard work despite the expensive manicure. Be brave with me, Isabella. Just for one night. She looked into his eyes and saw something that made her heart race. Not just attraction but possibility. The chance to be someone other than the polished professional who'd forgotten how to play, how to dream, how to take beautiful risks. "Okay," she whispered, and the word hung in the air like a prayer. "Okay." "Yes." She stood up, pulling him with her, sudden energy coursing through her veins. "But I have one condition." "Name it." "First stop is that diner in Phoenix. I want to sit in booth 7 and have a vanilla milkshake." Daniel's smile was radiant, transforming his entire face. For the first time all evening, he looked genuinely, completely happy. "Deal." They walked back toward the resort hand in hand. Two successful, powerful people who'd found something more valuable than wealth in each other: the courage to be vulnerable again. The champagne had lost its sparkle, and the desert air felt suffocating as Daniel stood on the resort's terrace, his hands gripping the stone railing until his knuckles turned white. Behind him, through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the reunion continuing. Trevor and Madison holding court, spinning their version of the evening's events to anyone who'd listen. Isabella approached slowly, her emerald dress rustling against the Arizona breeze. She'd watched the entire confrontation unfold from the sidelines, seen the way Daniel's face had transformed from confident to devastated in a matter of minutes. The revelation that had shattered everything wasn't what Trevor had said about Daniel's past. It was what Madison had whispered to her just moments before. "You don't actually believe his sob story, do you?" Madison had hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "The whole tech billionaire thing. Please. Isabella, honey, I've seen his LinkedIn. He works customer service at some dingy Phoenix call center. The suit's probably rented, and that watch? Total knockoff. He's still the same pathetic loser, just better at pretending." Isabella's heart had hammered against her chest. She'd done her own research after their magical afternoon in Sedona, but the internet was strangely quiet about Daniel Chen's supposed empire. No Forbes articles, no company headquarters, no verified social media presence. What if Madison was right? What if everything, the helicopter, the donations, the quiet confidence, was all an elaborate performance? Now, standing behind him on the terrace, Isabella felt the weight of her doubt crushing down on her chest. The man she'd started falling for, the man whose gentle touch had awakened something she'd thought was dead, might be living a complete lie. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the desert wind. He turned, and she saw it immediately: the raw pain in his dark eyes, the way his shoulders had collapsed inward. He looked exactly like the broken teenager from those old yearbook photos, despite the expensive clothes and perfect haircut. "You heard her, didn't you?" His voice was hollow, stripped of all the warmth she'd grown to love. "You heard what Madison said." Isabella's throat constricted. She wanted to lie to protect him, but the words wouldn't come. Her silence was enough. Daniel let out a bitter laugh that cut through the Arizona night like broken glass. "Of course you did. And you believe her." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of defeat. I don't know what to believe anymore," Isabella admitted, hating herself for the uncertainty in her voice. "Daniel, I tried to find information about your company online. Neuralink Solutions doesn't exist. There's no record of any AI patents under your name. The address you gave me in Beverly Hills belongs to a real estate holding company." Each word hit Daniel like a physical blow. He watched the woman he'd begun to envision a future with. Marriage in the chapel in Las Vegas, children playing in their backyard in Malibu, growing old together, slip away before his eyes. "So that's it then," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "After everything we shared in Sedona, after I told you things I've never told another living soul, you still think I'm that pathetic kid they used to shove into lockers." Isabella's heart was breaking, but her logical mind wouldn't let go. Then prove me wrong. Show me something concrete, anything that proves you're telling the truth. Because right now, all I have is your word, and Madison's showing me bank records, LinkedIn profiles. Madison's showing you what? Daniel's head snapped up, his eyes blazing with sudden fury. She pulled up your real LinkedIn profile on her phone. Customer service representative at Desert Valley Call Center. Salary: $31,000 a year. Daniel, if you've been lying to me. If I've been lying. Daniel's voice cracked like a whip across the terrace. Isabella, I told you my real name isn't even Daniel Chen anymore. I legally changed it from Danny Cheng when I turned 18 because I was tired of Trevor and his crew making fun of my weird Chinese name. Do you think someone living a lie would admit to that kind of shame? Isabella faltered, but Madison's evidence felt so concrete, so real. Then explain the LinkedIn profile. Explain why there's no trace of your company anywhere. Daniel closed his eyes, and when he opened them, they were filled with a pain so deep it took Isabella's breath away. Because I keep everything under shell companies and different legal names specifically to avoid situations like this. Because I learned a long time ago that when people know how much money you have, they either want to use you or destroy you. I've spent 7 years building walls to protect myself, and the one time I let them down, for you, this is what happens. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands. You want proof? Fine. Here's my private banker's number in Manhattan. Here's my attorney in Los Angeles. Here's the direct line to my CFO in San Francisco. Call any of them. Ask them about their client who goes by Daniel Chen but whose legal business name is DC Enterprises. Isabella stared at the phone, but doubt had already poisoned the well. How do I know these aren't just friends covering for you? The question hung in the desert air like a death sentence. Daniel's face went completely blank, and Isabella immediately knew she'd crossed a line she could never uncross. How do you know? Daniel repeated slowly, his voice now completely devoid of emotion. You don't. You'll never know because you've already decided who I am. Just like they did 7 years ago, just like everyone in that godforsaken Phoenix high school did. The only difference is I was stupid enough to think you were different. He turned to walk away, but Isabella grabbed his arm. Daniel, wait. Don't. He shrugged off her touch like it burned him. You know what the cruelest part is? It's not that you don't believe I'm successful. It's that you don't believe I'm worthy of success. That's what this is really about, isn't it? Deep down, you think I'm still that pathetic kid who deserved everything they did to him. Isabella's eyes filled with tears. That's not true. Isn't it? Daniel's laugh was broken, hollow. You've seen how I treat people, Isabella. You've seen my kindness, my integrity, the way I handled Trevor's attack tonight. If I were really some call center employee putting on an act, don't you think the mask would have slipped by now? Don't you think you'd have caught me in inconsistencies? The truth of his words hit her like a sledgehammer. She had seen his character, the way he'd tipped the helicopter pilot an extra $1,000, how he'd spoken to the homeless veteran in Sedona with genuine respect, the tears in his eyes when he talked about his mother working those double shifts in Phoenix. Those weren't the actions of someone performing a role. But it was too late. The damage was done. You want to know what my biggest regret is? Daniel continued, his voice breaking. It's not that I fell for you. It's that I let myself believe for one beautiful afternoon in Sedona that someone could love me for who I am instead of what I have. I actually thought I'd found someone who saw past the surface, who cared about my heart instead of my bank account. He looked at her one last time, and Isabella saw her own future crumbling in his eyes. All the possibilities they'd whispered about during their desert sunset, the life they could have built together, turning to ash. Goodbye, Isabella. Enjoy the rest of your reunion. Daniel walked back into the ballroom, leaving Isabella alone on the terrace with the crushing realization that she'd just destroyed the best thing that had ever happened to her. Through the windows, she watched him approach Madison and Trevor, his posture straight, his head high despite the devastation she knew was tearing him apart inside. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw him hand something to Madison. Probably contact information for his businesses, the proof she demanded. Then he walked toward the exit without looking back, his footsteps echoing across the marble floors like a funeral march. Isabella sank onto a stone bench, her emerald dress pooling around her like spilled wine. The desert wind carried the sound of laughter from inside, Trevor and Madison, no doubt celebrating their victory. They'd managed to destroy Daniel all over again, 7 years later, and this time they'd used her as their weapon. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Ms. Rodriguez, this is David Kim, Mr. Chen's attorney. He asked me to send you this as proof of his identity. I'm sorry you felt the need to verify his character, but I understand his request. Please find attached the incorporation documents for Neuralink Solutions, Mr. Chen's tax returns for the past 3 years, and a letter of recommendation from the governor of California. Mr. Chen wanted you to know that his feelings for you were real, even if yours apparently weren't. David Kim, senior partner, Kim and Associates, Beverly Hills. Isabella's hands shook as she opened the attachments. Every document was real. Every claim Daniel had made was true. Neuralink Solutions was worth $2.8 billion. Daniel's personal net worth was actually higher than he'd claimed. $347 million, just as he'd said in his penthouse that first morning. The LinkedIn profile Madison had shown her was fake, a cruel fabrication designed to plant seeds of doubt. And Isabella had fallen for it completely. She tried calling Daniel's number, but it went straight to voicemail. She tried texting, but the messages showed as undelivered. He'd already blocked her. Through the ballroom windows, she could see the reunion winding down. Trevor was taking selfies with his phone, probably posting about his successful evening on social media. Madison was flirting with the bartender, already moving on to her next target. Isabella buried her face in her hands and wept, for Daniel, for herself, for the love she'd thrown away because she'd chosen to believe the worst instead of trusting her heart. The desert stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the human drama playing out below, as Isabella Rodriguez learned the hardest lesson of her 29 years. Sometimes the greatest tragedy isn't being betrayed by your enemies. Sometimes it's betraying yourself. Daniel sat alone on the edge of his penthouse suite's private balcony, his legs dangling over the side as he stared out at the sprawling Phoenix lights below. The city that had once felt like a prison now stretched endlessly before him, each twinkling light a reminder of possibilities and dreams. His phone lay silent beside him. No missed calls, no messages from Isabella. The silence cut deeper than any of Trevor's cruel words ever had. The events of the evening played on repeat in his mind. The look in Isabella's eyes when she discovered the truth, not just about his wealth, but about his deception. The way her voice had cracked when she'd said, "You made me complicit in your revenge." The sound of her heels clicking away from him, each step echoing like a nail in the coffin of something beautiful that had barely begun to bloom. He pulled out his phone, thumb hovering over her contact. What could he possibly say? That he was sorry. That it had started as revenge but had become something real the moment she'd looked at him with genuine kindness? That somewhere between her defending him to Trevor and her gentle touch on his cheek, he'd fallen completely and irreversibly in love with her? The desert wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and memories. This was the same view he'd dreamed of as a 17-year-old kid, imagining the day he'd rise above it all. But success felt hollow when you had no one to share it with. All the money in the world couldn't buy back the trust he'd seen in Isabella's eyes before it all shattered. 3 floors below, Isabella sat in her rental car in the resort's parking garage, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She'd been there for an hour, engine off, just thinking. The professional side of her knew she should drive straight to Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport and catch the first flight back to Manhattan. Put 3,000 miles between herself and Daniel Chen, between herself and the mess of emotions churning in her chest. But she couldn't move. Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant Maya. "How did it go? Please tell me you're on your way to the airport." Isabella stared at the message, unable to type a response. How could she explain that the most arrogant, manipulative man she'd ever met had also shown her the most genuine tenderness she'd ever experienced? That his kiss had felt like coming home to a place she'd never been? That even now, knowing he'd used her, part of her understood why. She thought about her own high school experience in El Paso, Texas. She'd been popular, homecoming queen, everything Daniel hadn't been. But she remembered the quiet kids, the ones who ate alone, the ones her friends had casually dismissed. She'd never been cruel, but she'd never been kind either. She'd simply looked through them as if they didn't exist. Maybe that was worse than Trevor's active cruelty. At least Trevor had acknowledged Daniel's existence, even if it was to torment him. Isabella and kids like her had committed the sin of indifference, of making people feel invisible. Her phone rang, startling her. Daniel's name flashed on the screen. Her finger hovered over the decline button. The smart thing would be to ignore it, to preserve what was left of her professional dignity. But something in her chest, something that had nothing to do with logic or self-preservation, made her answer. "Isabella." His voice was rough, raw with emotion. "Please don't hang up." She closed her eyes, fighting the urge to end the call. "What do you want, Daniel?" "I want to explain." "There's nothing to explain," she cut him off, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "I understand exactly what happened. You needed someone to help you execute your revenge, and I was convenient." "That's not." He stopped and she could hear him breathing heavily. "Okay, yes. That's how it started. But, Isabella, what happened between us, what I felt?" "What did you feel?" Her voice cracked despite her efforts to stay controlled. "You mean the performance? The shy, wounded billionaire act? Because that's all it was, wasn't it? Another manipulation." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of truths neither wanted to face. "The wounded part was never an act," Daniel finally whispered. "The money, the success, the confidence, that was the performance. But when I was with you, when you looked at me like I mattered not because of what I'd accomplished but because of who I was, that was the first time in 7 years I felt real." Isabella felt tears she'd been holding back finally spill over. "Then why didn't you trust me with the truth?" "Because I was terrified," he admitted, his voice breaking. "Terrified that if you knew who I really was, not the billionaire, not the success story, but the angry, broken kid who still needed to prove himself to people who stopped mattering years ago, you'd see what they always saw. Someone not worth loving." Isabella closed her eyes, Daniel's words cutting through her anger like a knife through silk. She could picture him on that balcony, probably sitting on the edge the way he had as a kid, looking out at a world that had never made room for him. The image made her chest ache. "You're an idiot," she said softly. "I know. A complete and utter idiot. I know. You hurt me, Daniel. Not just professionally, but personally. I trusted you." "I know," he repeated, and she could hear the pain in his voice. "Isabella, I know I don't deserve it, but I'm asking for a chance to make this right. Not for my ego, not for revenge, not for anything but the possibility that what we felt tonight was real for both of us." Isabella wiped her eyes, staring up at the resort's upper floors. Somewhere up there, the man who'd held her like she was precious, who'd kissed her like she was salvation itself, was waiting for her answer. The same man who'd orchestrated an elaborate scheme to humiliate his former classmates. Both versions were real. The question was, which one did she choose to believe in? "Where are you?" she asked quietly. "Balcony of the penthouse suite." "Why?" She looked up, scanning the upper floors until she spotted a lone figure silhouetted against the night sky. Even from this distance, she could see the defeated slope of his shoulders, the way he held his phone like a lifeline. "I can see you," she said. Daniel straightened, looking down at the parking garage. "Isabella." She took a deep breath, making a choice that went against every professional instinct she'd ever developed. "I'm coming up. But Daniel, this is your one chance. One conversation to convince me that the man I fell for tonight is real, and not just another character in your elaborate performance." "He's real," Daniel said immediately. "Isabella, he's the most real I've ever been." She hung up and sat in her car for another moment, hands shaking slightly. Tomorrow she'd have to deal with the professional fallout. She'd have to explain to Maya and her other clients why she'd gotten personally involved with someone who'd essentially hired her company under false pretenses. But tonight she was just a woman who'd felt something extraordinary with a man who might be worth the risk. Isabella got out of her car and walked toward the elevator, her heart pounding with each step. She thought about all the romance novels she'd read where the heroine forgave the hero after a grand gesture, about all the movies where love conquered deception. This wasn't fiction. This was Messier, more complicated, with no guarantee of a happy ending. But as the elevator climbed toward the penthouse, carrying her toward a conversation that would change everything, Isabella realized she'd rather take the risk than spend the rest of her life wondering what might have been. The elevator dinged softly at the top floor. Through the glass doors, she could see Daniel pacing in his suite, running his hands through his hair. He looked up as she approached, hope and fear warring in his expression. Isabella took one last deep breath and knocked on the door, ready to discover whether love really could triumph over pride, hurt, and the complicated mess of their intertwined hearts. Scottsdale Resort, Arizona, 1 month later. The morning sun painted the Arizona desert in shades of gold and amber as Daniel stood on the terrace of the Scottsdale Resort's presidential suite, the same venue where his world had changed forever just 30 days ago. But this time he wasn't alone. Isabella emerged from the bedroom, her hair catching the light as she wrapped her arms around his waist from behind. "Still can't believe you bought the entire resort," she whispered against his shoulder, her voice filled with wonder and affection. Daniel turned in her embrace, his eyes soft with the kind of peace he'd never known before. "I had to make sure we'd have somewhere special to come back to. This place changed everything for me, for us. The past month has been a whirlwind." After that night when Isabella had chosen him over everything she thought she knew about success and status, Daniel had surprised himself by how little the money mattered. He donated $50 million to Phoenix area schools the very next week, funding arts programs and scholarship opportunities for kids like his younger self. Trevor, Madison, and Kyle had become footnotes in a story much larger than high school revenge. But the real transformation had happened in quieter moments. Late-night conversations where Isabella learned about Daniel's childhood, how his mother had worked 3 jobs to support his dreams. Morning walks through Central Park when he was in New York, evening drives through the Hollywood Hills when she visited California. They'd spent weeks just talking, discovering that beneath their successful exteriors were 2 people who'd always felt like they were performing, never quite belonging. "I have something for you," Daniel said, his voice carrying a nervous edge that reminded Isabella of the vulnerable man she'd fallen in love with that first night. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Isabella's breath caught, her hands flying to cover her mouth. "Isabella Rodriguez," he began, his voice steady but his hands trembling slightly. "You saw me when I couldn't see myself. You chose love over everything else that night, and you've been choosing it every day since." He dropped to one knee on the same terrace where they'd shared their first dance, where she'd whispered "I choose you" in his ear while Phoenix sparkled below them. "You taught me that all the success in the world means nothing without someone to share it with. You showed me that the boy those bullies tried to destroy had become a man worthy of real love." His eyes glistened with tears. "Will you marry me?" The ring was breathtaking, a rare pink diamond surrounded by smaller stones that caught the desert sunrise like captured starlight. But Isabella was looking at Daniel's face, at the hope and vulnerability written there, at the way 7 years of pain had transformed into something beautiful. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, laughing through her tears. "Yes, Daniel Chen. 1,000 times yes." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Isabella felt the last walls around her heart crumble completely. She'd built her life on coordinating perfect events for other people, always the organizer, never the bride. Now she was going to marry the most extraordinary man she'd ever known, not because of his money, but because of his heart. 6 months later, the wedding took place not in some exotic location Daniel could have afforded, but in the small Phoenix church where his mother had prayed for him every Sunday during those difficult high school years. Isabella had insisted. "Your story started here," she'd said. "Our new story should too." The guest list was deliberately small. Isabella's family from New Mexico, Daniel's mother, and the few close friends he'd made in the business world, and surprisingly Mrs. Patterson, his old high school physics teacher who had been the one bright spot during those dark years. As they exchanged vows in the simple chapel, with late afternoon Arizona sun streaming through stained glass windows, Daniel thought about the boy who used to walk these same Phoenix streets feeling invisible and worthless. That boy could never have imagined this moment. Not just the success, not just the money, but the love. Real, unconditional love from someone who chose him not despite his past, but because of how that past had shaped him into the man standing at this altar. "I promise to see you," Isabella said during her vows, her voice carrying clearly through the small chapel. "Not the headlines, not the bank account, not the success story, but you, Daniel. The brilliant, kind, generous man who still leaves physics books on my nightstand and donates anonymously to every charity I mention." When Daniel spoke his vows, his voice was steady, filled with quiet strength. "Isabella, you taught me that love isn't something you earn through achievement or success. It's something you choose every day to give and receive. I choose you not just today, but every day for the rest of our lives." As they danced their first dance as husband and wife to At Last by Etta James, Isabella whispered in his ear, "Do you ever think about them? Trevor and the others." Daniel was quiet for a moment, holding her closer. "Sometimes. But not with anger anymore. They were just kids too, trying to figure out where they belonged. If they hadn't pushed me so hard, maybe I never would have pushed myself to become who I am. Maybe I never would have been at that reunion to meet you." He spun her gently, her dress flowing around them like something out of a fairy tale. "Besides, I heard Trevor's working at a car dealership in Tempe now, trying to make ends meet. Madison's been married 3 times. Kyle never left Phoenix. They got exactly what they were always going to get. Ordinary lives filled with the same small thinking that made them cruel teenagers." "And you got extraordinary," Isabella smiled, her eyes sparkling. "No," Daniel said, pulling her close as the song reached its crescendo. "I got love. Real love. Everything else is just details." The reception was held in the same community center where Daniel had attended awkward school dances alone, transformed now with Isabella's touch into something magical. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Daniel's mother approached the newlyweds. "Mijo," she said, tears in her eyes as she embraced her son, "I always knew you were destined for something special. But this," she gestured toward Isabella, toward the joy radiating from both of them, "this is better than anything I could have prayed for." Isabella hugged her new mother-in-law tightly. "He's lucky to have had you believing in him all those years." "No, Mija," the older woman said, patting Isabella's cheek gently. "We're all lucky. Love like this. It doesn't happen often. You treasure it." Later that evening, as Daniel and Isabella sat alone on the steps of the church where they'd just promised their lives to each other, the Phoenix skyline twinkling in the distance, Isabella pulled out her phone. "What are you doing?" Daniel asked, amused. "Just checking something," she said, scrolling through social media. "Look." She showed him a post from Madison Walsh, now Madison Walsh Peterson Rodriguez, apparently husband number 3, "Can't believe some people think money changes everything. Real class is something you're born with. #blessed #authentic. The post had 3 likes. Daniel laughed, not with bitterness but with genuine amusement. She still doesn't get it. Get what? That none of this was ever about them. He gestured toward his ring, toward Isabella, toward the simple joy of sitting on church steps with the woman he loved. The best revenge isn't proving them wrong. It's becoming so happy that you forget they exist. Isabella leaned against his shoulder, watching the Arizona stars appear one by one in the desert sky. So what now, Mr. Chen? What does a tech billionaire do for an encore? Daniel was quiet for a moment, his arm tightening around his wife. Actually, I've been thinking about that. What would you say to moving to Austin, Texas? There's this program there for underprivileged kids interested in technology. I thought maybe we could start a foundation, help kids like I used to be. Kids who eat lunch alone and get shoved into lockers? Kids who have big dreams and bigger hearts, but just need someone to believe in them." Isabella turned to look at him, seeing not the successful businessman the world knew, but the compassionate man she'd fallen in love with. "I think that sounds perfect. Though I have one condition." "Anything. We make our first office in Phoenix. Right here where your story started. Show kids in this neighborhood that extraordinary things can grow from ordinary places." Daniel kissed her then, soft and sweet under the Arizona stars, tasting the salt of happy tears on both their lips. 7 years ago, he'd walked out of Westfield High School believing he was a failure, that he'd never be good enough for the popular kids, that success was measured in their approval. Now he understood the truth that had taken him $347 million and a lifetime of achievement to learn. The only approval that mattered was the love of a good woman and the peace that came from knowing exactly who you were. As Daniel and Isabella begin their new chapter together, focusing on lifting others up rather than proving doubters wrong, what do you think is the greatest victory? Professional success or finding someone who loves you exactly as you are? Share your thoughts about what truly makes a life extraordinary. The reunion that was supposed to humiliate him had given him everything he'd ever really wanted. Not revenge, not vindication, not even the sweet satisfaction of proving his worth to people who'd never mattered. It had given him love at last. And in Isabella's arms, surrounded by the warm Arizona night, Daniel Chin finally came home. Reflection question: what does this story tell us about the difference between achieving success to prove others wrong versus finding genuine happiness and love? Sometimes our greatest victories come not from showing our enemies who we've become, but from discovering who we were meant to be all along. Thanks for sticking with this story till the very end. But trust me, you haven't seen anything yet. The next story is crazier, more shocking, and will blow your mind. Click the image on your screen now and dive right in. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a single twist.